Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Shin-Godzilla. Now, Shin-Godzilla came out in 2016. It came out in Japan in 2016. However, the film did receive a limited theatrical release in the US. Now, Shin-Godzilla is technically the 31st Godzilla movie. However, if you don't count the 1998 Roland Emmerich remake of Godzilla, which a lot of people don't, then this would actually be the 30th Godzilla film. However, if you also don't count the 2014 American reboot, then this would actually be the 29th Godzilla film, and this is the 29th Godzilla film that was put out by Toho. Now, this is Toho's first Godzilla movie since 2004's Godzilla Final Wars. Now, Shin-Godzilla is a pure reboot of the Godzilla franchise. The film shares no continuity with any of the previous Godzilla films, including the original one, which prior to this movie coming out, I actually wondered if maybe this was going to be like a direct sequel to the original film and ignore the continuity of all the Godzilla films that came in between, but that's not the case. Now, the reason I wondered that, though, was because this is not the first time that Toho has rebooted the Godzilla franchise, but even when they rebooted it, they still kept the original film in continuity, but that's not the case with this film. But even though this is not in continuity with the original Godzilla film, I will say that the original film still kind of informs this movie in a lot of ways. The film also doesn't share any continuity with the 2014 Godzilla reboot that Gareth Edwards directed. But even though this one is not in continuity with the Gareth Edwards Godzilla film, I would also say that that one kind of informs this movie as well, because Toho very much made this movie as sort of their response to the 2014 American reboot of Godzilla. Now, the film itself is actually sort of a loose remake of the original Godzilla, and since this film once again is not in continuity with any of the previous Godzilla films, in this movie they also change Godzilla's origin and in a lot of ways really change what Godzilla was in any of the previous Godzilla films. Because the version of Godzilla that's in this movie is so radically different from any other incarnation of the character, and I could see that being a problem for some people, but I don't mind it because I kind of look at this as sort of like an Elseworlds Godzilla story. Now, for those of you who don't know what Elseworlds is something that DC does where they take a well-known character of theirs, like Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman, and they put them in a story that's set outside of the mainstream continuity, and they do radically different things with the characters. Like, that's kind of what Elseworlds stories are for DC. Marvel does something similar, but I don't believe they call it Elseworlds, though, but I kind of look at this as being sort of like the equivalent of an Elseworlds story. This is not set in any of the previous Godzilla continuities, so to me this movie's given free rein to do whatever it wants with the Godzilla mythos, and to me this is such a different take on the whole mythos of Godzilla, and I actually really liked that because to me this series has really evolved to the point where you could have different Godzilla continuities and you could have different takes on the whole Godzilla mythos. Now, the film was co-directed by, I'm probably going to butcher this director's name, but I believe it's pronounced Hideaki Anno. I know I'm sure I butchered his name, but prior to this he directed the 1995 anime film Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, I've never seen that movie because, truth be told, I'm not a big anime watcher. I like some anime, but I'm not a hardcore anime fan by any means, but that's actually a movie that I've always been familiar with, actually, because of another Godzilla movie. Because my VHS of Destroy All Monsters actually comes with a the trailer for Evangelion. The movie is also co-directed by another director that I'm probably going to butcher the name of, Shinji Higuchi. I'm pretty sure I butchered his name, but he also was the special effects director for the 90s Gamera series. He also did work on the 1984 Godzilla film, The Return of Godzilla. He also directed the live-action Attack on Titan movie. Now, Shin-Godzilla, I think, is one of the most unique Godzilla films ever made, and the film is actually a lot more political than you might think, which really shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who's familiar with the roots of this series, because the original Godzilla from 1954 is actually a very political film as well. The original Godzilla was made less than 10 years after the end of World War II, and at the time that movie came out, Japan was still rebuilding itself, and that movie was very much a statement about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It only used the city of Tokyo as sort of like a stand-in for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it used the giant monster Godzilla as a stand-in for the atomic bomb. But the original film is a very, very political film. And also, the original Godzilla film really is much more of a drama film that just happens to feature a giant monster as the main conflict of the story. But after the original Godzilla, Toho started making sequels, and as the sequels went on, the films lost the original political and social commentary that the first movie was going for, and eventually the series got geared more towards children, and the films got progressively goofier and goofier until the 1980s, when the series was rebooted in the form of The Return of Godzilla, which tried to return the series to its darker roots. But even after The Return of Godzilla, the series started to get kinda goofy again, and I feel like the whole Godzilla series sort of goes through cycles where it becomes really dark, but then gets goofy again. But once again, to me the Godzilla series has really evolved to the point where there's room for both types of Godzilla movies. There's room for the really silly, kid-friendly Godzilla films, and then there's room for the more darker, more politically driven Godzilla films. But I would say this movie, next to 1984's The Return of Godzilla, is probably the closest to the original in terms of what the film is trying to say. And this film really does return the series to its darker political roots. But while the original Godzilla was really a metaphor for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this film is actually making a commentary on the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, where a tsunami hit Japan and caused 3 nuclear meltdowns at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and this film is really a commentary on that whole disaster, but it's also sort of a criticism of the Japanese government's response to that disaster. And while this film is very much a political drama that just happens to feature a giant monster, there is some humor in the film, but the humor is very, very satirical. Once again, this movie is meant to be sort of a satire on the Japanese government's response to the 2011 Fukushima disaster. Now, the plot of Shin-Godzilla is, in the movie, a giant monster comes out of Tokyo Bay and starts attacking the city of Tokyo, and this monster is constantly mutating. The creature ends up getting codenamed Godzilla, or Gojira, which is the Japanese name for Godzilla. Once again, in this continuity, this is the first time that Godzilla ever showed up. And a lot of the movie really focuses on the Japanese government's efforts to try to stop this creature before it destroys all of Japan and then moves on to other countries and threatens the entire planet. And that's the basic plotline of Shin-Godzilla. There's a lot more to the movie than just that, but that's just the basic outline of the plot. And even though the overall story for this movie is fairly simple, what this film is trying to say and the film's message is actually really complex. Now, as far as Godzilla himself in this movie, I actually thought Godzilla was really cool in this movie, and I actually liked his look. I know some people really didn't like his look in this movie, but I actually really liked the look for Godzilla in this film, and a lot of people complained about Godzilla's eyes in this movie, but I actually really liked his eyes because, like, there's something kind of uncanny about them. Like, you got this feeling that it shouldn't be, and that's what Godzilla kind of feels like in this movie. He feels like something that shouldn't be, and that's why I actually liked the sort of googly eyes that Godzilla had, because there was something very creepy and very uncanny about Godzilla's eyes. And Godzilla looks fucking terrifying in this movie. Like, I mean, a giant monster in general would be pretty terrifying, but out of all the different looks for Godzilla throughout the entire series, this is definitely the scariest look for Godzilla. And this movie also has a very different take on the whole Godzilla mythos. I would actually really compare this one to the 2001 Godzilla film, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, because that was also a really unique take on the whole Godzilla mythos, and so is this film, because in this film, Godzilla actually goes through different stages and has different forms throughout the entire film. Like, in the beginning of the film, when Godzilla first makes landfall, he's, like, crawling on all fours, and he doesn't even remotely look like the Godzilla that we know. And I did see this movie in the theaters when it came out. I remember when I saw this in the theaters, some guy, like, 1 or 2 rows behind me saw what Godzilla looked like in, like, one of the first forms you see him in, and the guy was just like, "Oh my god, what the hell is that?" Like, you could kind of tell this guy wasn't too big on this new take on Godzilla, but once again, I actually really liked Godzilla's new take in this. Like, I liked how he has different forms in the film. But eventually in the film, the creature mutates into more of a similar form to what the Godzilla that we know. And one thing I thought was really interesting is in the film you see Godzilla with his iconic atomic breath, but whenever he breathes his atomic breath, his jaws actually open up. And Godzilla actually has like a little mouth at the end of his tail that shoots atomic breath out of that as well, and he also shoots atomic radiation out of his back. Once again, this is a very different take on Godzilla. And this movie really does change Godzilla's origin, because in the original series, Godzilla was a dinosaur that was sleeping at the bottom of the ocean for millions of years, but then nuclear testing awoken the creature and mutated it into the creature that we know in the original series. In this film, Godzilla is not actually a dinosaur per se, even though it takes on the form of a dinosaur. Rather, in the movie you find out that there was all this nuclear waste dumped into the ocean, and apparently Godzilla in this continuity originated as all these like prehistoric sea creatures that were mutated by the nuclear waste, and in order to survive they sort of merged together and formed into one creature that eventually formed into the creature that we see in this movie. And in the film, especially at the end, it's implied that the form we see Godzilla in is not the creature's final form. And once again, I just loved this take on Godzilla, and I could get to a certain extent why some people wouldn't like this version of Godzilla, but once again, in my opinion, the series has really evolved to the point where you could have all these different takes on the Godzilla mythology. Now, Shin-Godzilla is very much a satire or a criticism of bureaucracy, and it's a criticism of political incompetence, and the film also seems to be a critique of current Japanese society. Like, in the film, you see all this incompetence within the Japanese government, and nobody really knows how to handle Godzilla. Like, when Godzilla first shows up, everybody's like, I don't know what to do. But to me, that's actually kind of realistic, because realistically, if a giant monster did show up, nobody's gonna actually know what the fuck to do. But in the movie, you get a real sense that this incompetence, in some ways, is kind of making the crisis even worse. Like, in this movie, you get a real sense that if the Japanese government just acted soon enough, maybe they could have actually killed this creature early on when it was in one of its earlier forms, but because they didn't act soon enough, this creature mutated to the point where it became indestructible, and if they just acted soon enough, maybe all these lives could have been saved. And if you wanted to, you could really connect that to how the Japanese government in real life handled the Fukushima disaster of 2011. But the thing is, though, even though the film is very critical of the Japanese government and Japanese bureaucracy, and even though the film is very much a satire on Japanese bureaucracy, at the same time, though, I feel like a lot of the incompetence that you see in this movie from the politicians is actually kind of understandable given the situation, because realistically, if a giant monster did show up, once again, nobody's gonna know what to do about this thing, so I feel like the incompetence that you see in this movie is believable and even sympathetic in a way. And the movie very much makes a commentary on how the Japanese government is very much subservient to the American government, and in the film, you see, like, the Japanese politicians constantly referring to, like, the American government, and once again, the film very much makes a point about how the Japanese government, ever since World War II, has been very much subservient to the American government, and it gives you this idea that Japan is still sort of living in the shadow of World War II, even though they very much rebuilt themselves after World War II, and they're not the same country they were during World War II when they were very imperialistic and very totalitarian. Like, they very much have learned the lessons of the past, or at least it seems that way, but it also seems like they're still very much living in the shadow of World War II, and are still sort of paying for the sins of their fathers and grandfathers. And in this movie, there's a certain point where the United States government decides to drop a nuke on Tokyo in order to destroy Godzilla, and they give the Japanese government some time to evacuate the city of Tokyo, but in the film you see a lot of the characters kind of get more concerned about this than the creature itself. And it sort of brings up this question, is Japan so subservient to America that they're just gonna let them nuke them again? But in the movie, you see Japan trying to deal with this creature on their own and try to overcome this on their own terms, and you get a real sense that even though Godzilla attacking Tokyo is a major tragedy, at the same time, it's putting their national pride to the ultimate test. So, this is a very, very politically charged movie, so in that sense, it's very similar to the original Godzilla, but there is some dark humor in this movie, which wasn't in the original Godzilla, because the original Godzilla was a pretty dead serious movie. This film is much more comedic than the original Godzilla. Well, not 100% comedic, like, but there's definitely some dark comedy in this film, but it's dark, dark freaking comedy. Now, one thing about this movie that might not be everybody's cup of tea is there really isn't a character in this movie who you could call a central protagonist. Like, there's not really a main character per se. Like, there's a couple of characters in the film that you follow, and the human characters in this film, they are likable and they are interesting. At the same time, though, you don't really get to know them too well, and I kind of see what they were going for with this, because apparently the characters in this movie were meant to be more of a metaphor for Japan as a whole, so the characters, they kind of come off as being more like allegories rather than legit characters, and I see what they were going for. At the same time, though, I could see that being a problem for some people. But the characters were likable, though, and there is some interesting, like, philosophical dialogue between the characters. about the nature of Godzilla that definitely hits home the themes of this movie. My only complaint about the dialogue, though, is some of the dialogue is so rapid-fire that it's kind of hard to keep up with all of it, especially because the whole film's in Japanese with English subtitles, so sometimes the dialogue goes by so fast that you really have to be paying attention to the subtitles. And I remember I saw this in the theater, and it was kind of hard to keep up with everything that was being said. Now, for me, the one character who really sort of stood out the most was this character who was actually a Japanese American, who you find out in the movie actually has the potential to be a US president at some point in the future. And she was a likable character, but one issue I had with this character is you're supposed to believe that she grew up in America and was born in America and even has the potential to be a US president. The issue is, though, her English in the movie is not very good. So I don't know if that was done on purpose to be sort of satirical and be sort of like a subtle jab at America. I'm not sure, but I don't know, like, her English in the film is not very good, and yet you're supposed to believe that this is somebody from America. But that's really, once again, I don't know if that was done on purpose or not, so I'm not sure if I should really be criticizing that too much. Now, in the movie, Godzilla is mostly CGI, he's mostly motion capture, and I would say for the most part, Godzilla looks pretty good in this film. As I mentioned before, Godzilla's look in this movie is one of my favorite looks for Godzilla throughout the entire series, and I would say for the most part, the special effects in this movie are pretty good, but there are certain moments in this film where the CGI is very, very questionable, and there are points where the CGI is downright fake looking, so not all the effects in this movie are perfect, but for the most part, I would say the effects are pretty good. Now, the music in this movie I thought was really interesting. Now, there is an original score for this movie, and I really liked the original music for this film, but they also used some of Akira Ifukube's score for the original Godzilla in this movie, and there were points where I thought it fit, and then there were points where I didn't think it fit that well, where it almost seems sort of out of place, but I did appreciate that they used the score from the original film at certain points in this movie, also kind of hitting home how this film is so similar to the original film. And they don't just use Ifukube's score from the original film, but they also use some of his score from some of the other Godzilla films as well. But yeah, Shin-Godzilla is an excellent movie. It's a much deeper and much more politically driven film than you might be expecting if you're only familiar with some of the more cheesy Godzilla films. But if you're a fan of the original Godzilla, or The Return of Godzilla, or even GMK, if you're a fan of the more politically driven Godzilla films, then you would definitely like this one. And I don't like this movie as much as the original Godzilla, or even Godzilla 1985, but I still really enjoyed this one, and I think this is definitely going to go down in history as one of the great Godzilla movies. The movie also has a very ambiguous ending that you could definitely draw a lot of different interpretations from, and I know they're trying to do a sequel to this, but I actually feel like a sequel, as much as I do want to see a sequel to this one, I feel like a sequel might sort of ruin the ambiguous ending, though, because obviously, if they do a direct sequel to this one, they're gonna have to explain that ending. Now, as I mentioned before, Toho very much made this movie as sort of their response to the 2014 American reboot of Godzilla, which was directed by Gareth Edwards, and even though I liked the 2014 film, in a lot of ways I feel like this film is what the 2014 film should have been. At the same time, though, I understand why the 2014 film was not like this film. My issue with Gareth Edwards' Godzilla is, even though I do like that movie, that before that movie came out, they were claiming that this was going to return the series to its roots and make Godzilla dark and serious again, and the film really wasn't that dark, like, at all, and the film really wasn't anything like the original Godzilla film at all, even though the trailers sort of made it look like it was going to be like the original film. And I still liked the 2014 Godzilla film, but it was nothing like the original Godzilla. The most that it had in common with the original film is there was an emphasis on the human characters, and the film tried to focus on how human beings would react to a situation like that, but the characters in the 2014 film were nowhere near as believable as the characters in the original Godzilla. To me, the 2014 Godzilla film felt so much more like one of the 70s Godzilla films, just taking itself slightly more seriously and with a bigger budget. And the ironic thing about this movie, though, is this film is such a different take on the whole Godzilla mythos, whereas the 2014 one was playing it way too safe, yet at the same time, though, this one is far more closer to the tone of the original film than the Gareth Edwards movie. The thing is, though, I understand why the Gareth Edwards one was not more like this one, or even more like the original Godzilla, because they were trying to play it safe, considering how poorly received the first American reboot of Godzilla was. Gareth Edwards and Legendary were playing it very safe, and truth be told, I understand why they did that. One thing I think is really interesting is the Gareth Edwards Godzilla film came out in 2014, which was the 60th anniversary of the original Godzilla, and this movie came out in 2016, which was the 60th anniversary of Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was the Americanized version of the original film. I don't know if that was done on purpose or not, but that is kind of interesting. Now, I'm actually pretty excited about future Godzilla films. The next Godzilla film that's coming out is actually going to be an anime Godzilla film titled Godzilla Monster Planet, and the premise of the movie actually sounds really interesting. Now, it's coming out this year, 2017. It's going to be coming out in November of this year in Japan, but shortly after that, it's going to be put on Netflix here in the United States. And I'm really excited about that one, even though I'll admit, based on the trailers for the movie, I'm not crazy about the animation style. Now, to the best of my knowledge, that one is gonna have no continuity with this one. It's gonna be set completely in its own timeline, and from what I heard about that one, though, I heard that that one is also gonna be a very different take on the Godzilla mythology. And apparently this anime Godzilla film is going to be the first of a trilogy, like Toho's already planning on doing 2 sequels to that one. And Legendary is already going ahead with their Godzilla series, which is going to be called the Monsterverse, and they already came out with the movie Kong Skull Island, which was a King Kong movie. However, it's set in the same universe as the 2014 Godzilla film, and you get little references to Godzilla in that movie. And the next installment of Legendary's Monsterverse is going to be Godzilla King of Monsters, which is also going to have Rodan, Mothra, and King Ghidorah. That I'm really excited about, especially considering who's directing the movie. It's being directed by Michael Daltrey. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, but he also directed Krampus, which I freaking adored. And Legendary's Monsterverse is actually leading up to a remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which is going to be coming out in, I want to say 2020, me. And that one I'm pretty excited about because Adam Wingard is directing it, who I've only seen 2 of his movies, Blair Witch and The Guest, but truth be told, I liked both of them, so I'm really excited to see what he does with this remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla. And apparently Toho is planning on doing a direct sequel to this movie. However, apparently they want to wait till the legendary Godzilla series has run its course before they continue on with the Shin-Godzilla series. But I think that's really interesting how right now you basically have 3 separate Godzilla series happening almost simultaneously. So yeah, that was my review on Shin-Godzilla, and bye.